Hello and welcome to another episode of the Try Mechanics podcast. This is another podcast all about the microbiome. Now, I'm really sorry that I've not been around much recently. That is because I've had the joy of having a little baby boy who is currently sitting next to me right now. That's, if you can hear a little bit of a buzzing in the background, that's him on his bouncer that buzzes and keeps him nice and asleep whilst I have the very short amount of time to record a short podcast. So, the series that I've been doing about the microbiome, the reason that's become so important to me, as I've mentioned a few times, is that whilst the microbiome might not be everything, and I think we're in this age maybe where we're starting to suddenly think that it might be really important, and some people in the field might say that it is almost a unifying theory when it comes to all diseases and various other things, and that's definitely not true. The microbiome has an impact. They are part of us. They are not completely us. There is still our own biology there. But what we're starting to realise is that they have a far-reaching effect throughout our body. They do so many different things. If you read one of the books I'm reading recently that is called We Contain Multitudes, it's all about the microbiome as of all these different books that I've read over the past few years. But every book seems to present a slightly different argument, or at least it gives different information. Now, one of the things that this book focused on was the idea that we act with our bacteria. The idea we're kind of symbiotes. We work together to produce various things. And it uses various examples that have been studied throughout nature of, for instance, animals that live in environments where their only access is to a food that previously was very toxic. And then certain animals within those groups became essentially immune to it, and we didn't really understand what was going on. We presumed that the animal itself was producing the producing the antitoxin to the toxin in the food. But that's not the case. It turns out it was a bacteria. And almost all of these cases turn out that it's actually a bacteria because they are evolving much faster than we are. This is the problem we have with antibiotic resistance. Have you ever really come across this idea that when we produce antibiotics, most bacteria, or a lot of bacteria now, are getting more and more resistant to some of these antibiotics. At least they don't seem to work as well as they used to, and that's because bacteria evolve very rapidly. Because they evolve very rapidly, because they're very simple to a certain stimulus, it doesn't take much for them to then learn how to essentially adapt and deal with that stimulus, be it an antibiotic, be it an environmental toxin. And then, because of that, they very, very rapidly pass it on to their children as they divide, as they grow, and then they pass it on to other bacteria, because bacteria communicate by, essentially, it's almost like you can imagine they're kind of linking horns, and they use that to pass their DNA between each other, which means that if a bacteria has a mutation that produces DNA that allows it to produce an antitoxin to something, and that means that it then thrives because it actually can maybe use the kind of detoxified product for fuel or something along those lines. It will then pass on that bit of DNA to the bacteria that it meets, and they become immune too. So what we're starting to understand is that the bacteria are crucial. Maybe the unifying theory is that we've changed our world very rapidly over the past few months. I look back over my kind of reading history of the things that I've become interested in, or things that I believe are the kind of modern front of medicine and health at the moment. And it's things like circadian rhythm. I'm reading Sachin Panda's book, The Circadian Code, which is fantastic. It is all about the fact that the access to light has changed. We did used to have access to light, but it was in very short supply and demand. One of the quotes he uses is actually when we first kind of got to the point of burning fuel for light, it could have cost, in today's money, it would have cost thousands to light a house for the evening. Therefore, most people didn't actually use these fuels for light. They used them very sparingly for cooking and various other more essential processes. And in the evening, they went to bed. And we know now that the other thing about that is that all the lights we always had in history have been things like firelight and lights. Then we end up with lights, the kind of incandescent bulbs, which put out a more balanced light spectrum, but are still more on the towards the red side, or at least put out more of the red, less of the blue. The problem is we've developed these LEDs and these various bulbs that we thought were a really good idea, most indoor lighting now, particularly, we all have these LED lights. It's a fantastic idea, we thought, but it actually turns out it's a very, very bad idea, because it's not just light, it's the spectrum. It's all about blue light, because actually within the eye, within the sensors that tell us it's day and night, the circadian rhythm of the eye, the release of what's called melanopsin, which is to do with, and then this has an effect on things like melatonin and various other hormones. That molecule is released from cells that are far more responsive to blue light than they are responsive to other types of wavelength. Therefore, those blue light bulbs are very damaging. Now, you can do a few things with this. You can do things like taking away or putting your iPhone onto night shift mode. Now, I've gone even a step further, as I've made mine a red spectrum, so you can actually go in and change the colours. And this means that my phone puts out almost no blue light at all. When I do use it after about 8 o'clock, I have the screen on absolute, as dim as it possibly goes, no light at all. I can just read it. And if I can't read it, then I won't bother. And that's the key thing, is that this exposure to these bright blue light screens in the evening are really, really bad after a certain point. Now, in the morning, it can be quite good. Blue light is what we want, because blue light is what the sun is giving us in the morning through that UV and the kind of white light spectrum. We're getting all that blue light in the morning, and that's what we want. So we want to get exposed to that blue light. And the more you get exposed to the blue light and the sunlight in the day, the more protective you're against the blue light exposure at night, which is really, really interesting, but not completely. So you can't spend your whole day in blue light and expect to not have any input or any impact from having that blue light. Anyway, off on a slight tangent, I will cover the circadian rhythm stuff in another podcast, because this is about the microbiome again, and this is a bit of a final thing, a bit of a summary, and really it's a question. And it's a question that's come up time and time again in my research that while I've been looking through this thing. And when you look at the science, but also look at the indigenous populations, you get this question of prebiotic versus probiotic. So think about probiotics. We know probiotics are the ingestion of what we call friendly bacteria. There is no such thing as a friendly bacteria. We've got to get that out there straight away, is that there's no, you take one bacteria, we think of things like Clostridium, and Clostridia species is bad because we heard of Clostridium difficile or difficile. And the key thing about that is that one species can cause an overgrowth, it can cause a problem, but actually other members of the species are very, very important. Same as E. coli. There are certain species that are quite important to us, yet when we get an overgrowth of certain types of E. coli, they can cause damage and problems. Even the good guys, even the Acidophilus, the bifidum species, can cause overgrowth. It can cause small arterial bowel overgrowth if they get to the wrong place. And that's the key thing, is that when we've got to think about it, we've got to think about probiotics. We've also got to think about what probiotics actually are. The reason we've ended up with probiotics, or the reason we've ended up with the certain species of probiotics, is because of convenience. The fact that we can grow these probiotics in things like milk. So we've ended up with lactis kind of Acidophilus and lactis bacillus and bifidum species because they grow very easily in milk. So natural history meant that we actually grew them without wanting to. Makes them very easy to produce. Plus, that meant that certain cultures, because this is the way they made it, Bulgarian cultures that made yogurt, that's where a lot of these yogurts came from. So that's why you have lactis bacillus bulgaris in most yogurts. That was enabled them to do those things. And that's the key thing, is that those aren't really the star players at all. They're really just a very small subset of relatively useful bacteria in our gut that can help us digest those things. So we actually would rather species like Akkermansia and various other species, but we don't grow those because they are anaerobic. They are very, very difficult to grow outside of the body because they cannot, literally, you cannot even show them oxygen and they will all die. And that's the problem, is we've got this distorted subset of species that we've grown for probiotics, but we continually show that probiotics seem to have some kind of benefit, or at least a lot of studies show they do. And that's possibly because they act more as signalers, more as essentially adding a little bit of troops to the mix, but at the same time they seem to then confer other changes in the bacteria that are already in your gut. So if you added in a little bit of those species, it almost seems to signal help the growth of other species within the gut. And that's why things like the kind of soil-based organisms, like Bacillus coagulans, which is a soil-based organism that's got some good research behind it, seems to work, even though it's not a bacteria that we're really meant to have as such. It's spore forming, which means it gets through into the digestive system, and it seems to signal to other good bacteria down there to help them do their job better. But the end up is, should we be taking probiotics? Should we be taking bacteria? Now, I think the best way of thinking about this is looking at indigenous cultures and what they do. And the really interesting thing is that when you look at the fermented food from a lot of these cultures, a lot of the fermented food they consume is actually pasteurised. It's actually not got the bacteria in it anymore, which is really, really interesting, because we think that we would need to take in these live bacteria, but actually some studies have shown that yogurt that has been pasteurised is still beneficial. And if you look at a lot of these cultures take in small amounts of the actual probiotic, the actual bacteria-containing thing. If you think of sauerkraut, I actually have never had raw sauerkraut in Germany. You can get it a lot in the kind of health food shops now, yet when you go to Germany, not only when you buy it do you get it pasteurised because it has to then be put in a jar and sold, but also even when they make it themselves, they often then cook it, which would kill all the bacteria in it. They're consuming sauerkraut for a couple of reasons. They're consuming it because it's ridiculously high in certain vitamins because of the bacteria. The bacteria have made and synthesized those B vitamins and various other vitamins that we need, but also the signalers, and the fact that the sauerkraut contains a lot of things that then enhance your gut health through signaling to other bacteria. Same as things like yogurt. There's actually a lot of evidence that a lot of Greek yogurt would have been pasteurised, would have been heated, warmed slowly, and then allowed to cool again, which is very interesting. If you look at things like sourdough, sourdough is live bacteria, but then it is cooked and eaten. So it is these things would then start to think, if you look at an indigenous diet, and again, I love to say this point that we are trying to over-science everything these days. When it comes to things like bacteria, health, nutrition, all these things, science might be actually doing more harm than good, because it seems to suddenly say that something is more beneficial than it is because it's taking things in a vacuum. But also, why are we bothering to over-science some of these things when the indigenous populations have essentially done it for us through trial and error? So you look at indigenous diets and their shift, they don't consume many probiotics. They consume ridiculous amounts of the right kinds of prebiotics. And actually, if you look at what's changed over the past few years, our sugar consumption has gone down, our fat consumption has gone down, yet also our prebiotic fibres, the right kind of fibre, has also gone down. I've banged on this about this so many times, that things like your lettuce leaves, they're not what your bacteria want. And that's the critical thing. If you look and it's the best book I've got on this is The Jungle Effect. This was written almost over 10 years ago. I think it might even be longer. It had this idea. It looked around the different indigenous kind of blue zones around the world. These places where there was very little of certain diseases, and every single one, they may eat completely different diets. You go to Mexico and they're eating lots of beans. You go to Africa and they're eating the kind of slightly fermented, kind of porridgey type grains. You go to other places like Okinawa where they're having lots of fish and there are various other things. But the thing that runs through all of those diets is the fact that they have a lot of prebiotic fibres. So things like inulin. Inulin is what's called a fructooligosaccharide. It is something that is very difficult to break down we don't break it down. Our bacteria break it down for us. It comes in different chain lengths, which can actually affect what type of bacteria have it and where it gets to. But it tends to go almost all the way through us. It's very resistant to it's completely resistant to digestion by us. It gets almost all the way down often down into the large bowel where the bifidum are and various other species. And they ferment it, and that nourishes the bowel. Now, inulin, you could buy inulin. I do. I use it as a supplement simply because I find it a fantastic addition to things like smoothies and those kind of things. But actually, You don't really need to, because actually if you eat things like onion, garlic, asparagus, chicory and all these things, they have tons of this inulin. So if you look at the amount of fibre that's consumed by these populations, take things like beans, legumes and all those things. Now the funny thing is these are a lot of foods have been vilified by things like the low FODMAP diet or the paleo diet because they're supposedly full of anti-nutrients, they're very hard to break down. Well, yes, in a lab, when you look at them, yes, they have things called lectins on. These lectins may do harm when they are left exposed to a gut cell. However, that is in a vacuum. It is very much the same as gluten. I can give you tons of research that shows that gluten proteins damage gut cells and can cause damage, gliadin and various other metabolites, zonulins and these other proteins that are found in wheat. However, put a big load of bifidum bacteria, is a good example, bifidum longum infantis, on them, and you don't get any problem at all because they digest those proteins. We are actually really good at taking in very toxic substances, or what could be toxic substances, and adapting very rapidly, but we are not adapting. Our bacteria are doing that for us. This is why it is so often so important, or why the whole premise of the jungle effect is that we are healthiest when we are eating the diet that we are meant to eat. And the premise of the book was that it started off with a patient who she was from, I believe she was kind of Costa Rican, from kind of middle America, and it was getting very unwell living in the States. And when she went back to where she came from, she suddenly got a lot healthier and lost a lot of weight. And then the second she came back to the States, she got ill again. And it was because her gut bacteria was set up to digest the diet that she was basically used to, or they'd exchanged all their DNA to make sure they could break down all these lectins, these proteins and these things. Actually, suddenly, when these weren't in the diet, they not only suffered, but also the things that were added in were causing problems. A great example of this is seaweed. Most Western people cannot digest seaweed properly. And so therefore, there's some good things in it, and there's good things of iodine, but actually the carbohydrates in seaweed are completely undigestible to most Western people. However, the Japanese, as a good example, have a certain bacteria that allows them to digest that seaweed. And that's a perfect example of how a lot of these things work. And that's what we're starting to understand now, is that actually health changes when we go outside of what we were supposed to have. So as a British person, what do you eat? What do you eat if you're thinking, well, a lot of these paleo things are looking at these really exotic foods. Do I need to eat coconut? Do I need to follow this POP type diet, which is essentially complete rubbish? No, I don't. I don't necessarily need to have those things in that our bacteria over here, we're meant to have things like potatoes and those kind of foods and those root vegetables. And that's where, you think of, we talk about the Mediterranean diet, but the Mediterranean diet is a fantastic diet. Do not get me wrong. All the things in it help feed the bacteria. They are probiotics. Almost everything in the Mediterranean diet is a prebiotic. They really enhance the bacteria, and they enhance our ability to not only enhance the bacteria, but they enhance the ability of the bacteria to provide us with what we need. But also, a lot of those things are found in things that we grow or we have grown traditionally over here. Things like the root vegetables, colourful vegetables, carrots, green veg, spinaches and those things. They are very high in those, the same type of molecules that you'll find very heavily in the Mediterranean diet. But it's also a lifestyle. The Mediterranean diet is also encompassing this idea of being out in the sun and all these things that we don't necessarily have over here because we don't like to be out in the cold. Therefore, we don't get out in the sun much in the winter because of those things. So it is very difficult to fit all those things in. But when it comes to this argument of prebiotic versus probiotic, the evidence, all the research would go towards prebiotic. Even the research behind indigenous diets, looking at the tradition, goes towards prebiotic. The research, the science, goes towards, again, prebiotic. The fact that probiotics on their own do very little. Probiotics with the right dose of prebiotics can be absolutely fantastic. So, end up, the argument is that probiotics are not inherently good or bad, but getting the right strains could prove quite important. But take those probiotics, if you're going to have them, with a dose of prebiotics. Get in prebiotics throughout every meal. Make sure you're getting in all these things like beans, peas, and legumes, resistant starches, all these different things, these basically long chain carbohydrates, inulin, onions, garlic, all the flavonoids, things like dark chocolate, olive oil, tomatoes, all those things, all the colourful vegetables. The different bacteria love those. They are all prebiotics. They all enhance the growth of the bacteria that we want, that enable us to produce they produce for us a lot of the vitamins that we need to function. So that's my kind of general summary. It's a little bit wishy-washy in places, and I'm not going to talk in these podcasts about certain studies because I've read hundreds of these different studies, and if I could easily talk about one particular study, next particular study that shows this and that, but it's all about looking at the whole picture when you look at this kind of research. So one study will show one thing, one study will show another thing, but if you put them together, and this is the idea behind things like meta-analysis and reviews, you put it all together and you generally get a trend, and the general trend is that increasing that good quality fibre is a very good thing. Having a few natural probiotic foods is also a very good thing. But trying a few bits of probiotic supplement, if you've got gastrointestinal upset, along with lots of prebiotics can really work. Having the probiotics on their own will probably do very little. That's where I'm going to leave things for now. I hope you've enjoyed that little bit of a summary and a bit of a kind of mix through of various things. I want you to go out and get some prebiotics. I want you to go out and get those foods, get them into your diet, see whether they make you feel any better. They initially may make you feel a little worse if you are using markers as things like wind and various other things. So don't overdo it, because those bacteria will love it and they will produce lots of wind, and that is completely normal. But that can make you feel a bit sicky initially if you suddenly throw a load of those in to those bacteria. They will grab them and they will produce lots of gas, because you'll probably, if you have issues with your digestion, you may only have, or you may have less species, and certain species love those foods, and they'll rather than one of them having one bit and the other having the other bit, they'll take that food and they'll produce loads of gas, and they'll do really well, but that gas might make you feel a little bit unwell initially. So take it easy, add those things in. So things like inulin, if you are going to use inulin powder, then use it very, very sparingly. Half a teaspoon or a teaspoon at a time, once or twice a day, is more than enough to feed those good bacteria really well. Hope you've enjoyed listening. Hopefully I'll be back again soon if this little monster allows me to. And let me know how you're getting on with this, and any questions you've got around this, send them across. I really enjoy doing this stuff, so please ask questions so that I can actually provide some information that's going to help people. Thank you very much, and goodbye.